Welcome to week 17, Cornerstone's One House Bible in a Year series. This week, we're going to be finishing up the story of Elijah, and then we're going to pass it on to someone with a very similar name, Elisha. And yes, those names do get confusing at times. We'll be in 2 Kings, we'll be in 1 Kings and going into 2 Kings this week. And we're also going to meet two nefarious characters named Ahab and Jezebel, two of the most evil names in the entire Bible. In fact, the woman Jezebel, her name has become synonymous with idol worship and demonic influence. Even today, it's used as a term of derision upon people. It comes up at the very end in the book of Revelation. Our last week together, we will see Jezebel's name come up again, and it's always in a negative context. So let's take a look at what happens here in the reading this week in 1 Kings 19 all the way through to 2 Kings chapter 17. Yeah, now 1 Kings 19 to 2 Kings 17 is what we'll be looking at today. So let's begin. 1 Kings 19 starts with Elijah taking Elisha as a student. And yes, those names will continue to confuse you even today. If you were to name, 5 events out of their lives and had me pick which one did which, I'd probably get as many wrong as right. It's a challenge, but that's what we've got, Elijah and Elisha. In chapter 20 then of 1 Kings, we have the attack on Samaria. So let me re-explain what we talked about last week, because it is a challenge for any Bible reader. And if you've been reading up until now, it can be a real challenge. Here's what's happened. Up until last week, when you heard the name Israel, it meant the entire nation of all 12 tribes. Last week, at the end of our reading, we saw Solomon die, and then a dispute over who should rule the kingdom, and loyalties got divided. And so now we have 2 nations. So from this point on, whenever we hear the name Israel, it means the nation of 10 tribes to the north. And whenever we hear the name Judah, it means the nation of 2 tribes to the south. So we now have 2 different nations. Jerusalem is the capital of Judah, the 2 tribes to the south. Samaria becomes the capital of Israel, the 10 tribes to the north. And if that's not confusing enough, Samaria not only can refer to the city that is the capital of Israel, it also describes the region around the city, kind of like New York City and New York State, right? So you've got Samaria, the city, you've got Samaria, the region, and that region called Samaria is in both the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. Confused? Yeah, that just gives you an idea of what's going on, okay? So Samaria becomes the capital of the north. Jerusalem is the capital in the south. In Samaria, both the city and the region and all of the 10 northern tribes called Israel that are ruled from Samaria, in that area, they had blended pagan worship and Jewish worship for many generations. And so now that kind of becomes the de facto religion of Israel to the north. This is biblically the worst kind of sin. Even in Revelation, again, when we get to it in the last week of this entire series, God will say, I wish you were hot or cold, because you're lukewarm. I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. God basically says, pick one side or the other. Don't try to blend the two. But what Samaria has done is they blend the two. They try to blend pagan worship with Jewish worship, and God simply will not accept that. It's so bad that even the name Samaria has a stain on it over 600 years later when Jesus shows up, right? We know this because in several stories in the life of Jesus, which we'll get to, a couple months from now, the disciples are shocked. First of all, when Jesus even decided to walk through Samaria, they were shocked. By the time of Jesus, Samaria was considered so vile to the Jewish people, they would go out of their way to walk around it, even if walking through it was easier. But Jesus went through Samaria. Secondly, they were shocked when Jesus talked to a Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. First of all, talking to a woman. Secondly, talking to a Samaritan. They were stunned by that. And then in Luke 10, they're shocked when Jesus made up a story in which he could have made anybody the hero, and he intentionally made a Samaritan the hero of the story, right? We all know the phrase Good Samaritan, and we don't know what it's connected to. First of all, it's connected to the story that Jesus told. And by picking a Samaritan as the hero, he's picking as a hero a person from the group that they most despised. And as we're going to see this week, we understand why they're despised. They did very, very evil things. So all of that story will begin in our passage this week. So look for that as you go through it. So some of the evil that happens from Samaria and in the northern kingdom, we then see in 1 Kings chapters 21 and 22, which is where the book of 1 Kings ends up. You got the king and queen in the northern kingdom named Ahab and Jezebel. And we're going to see how they battle against the nation of Aram. Aram is modern day Syria, to the north and west of the nation of Israel. Syria, Aram is still a thorn in Israel's side today, and a thorn is putting it mildly. We then will jump over to the book of 2 Kings, and in chapter 1, we'll see the death of Ahaziah, who is one of the kings in Israel who rules out of Samaria. And then in 2 Kings chapter 2, we're going to see this amazing story of Elijah being taken up into heaven. Remember this story about Elijah. You'll read it this week. Remember it for later, because this is the last of three, I'm going to call them non-deaths in the Old Testament. Enoch was the first who walked with God and then was not, because God took him, as the old King James says in Genesis 5:24. Moses in Deuteronomy 34 goes up to the mountain, he dies, and it says that the angels take care of his body. So you've got these three people with these interesting non-deaths or supernatural deaths that are going on. And it's important because much later on, when we get to the Gospels in the New Testament, at the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus will have Moses and Elijah appear with him. And it happens to be two of the three people who had deaths in which their body either didn't die or was taken care of by angels in a supernatural way. So Elijah goes up in this chariot of fire. Moses' body is taken care of by angels. And later on, both of them appear with Jesus at the Mount of Transfiguration. It can't be a coincidence that their bodies at the time of their departure from this earth were treated in such a special way. So that happens in 2 Kings 2. We'll see that this week. Then we go to 2 Kings 3, where Moab will revolt. This is the modern day Jordan, just across the Dead Sea from southern Israel. This always happens when we're divided and when we're weak. That's when the enemy attacks. And we'll see that in chapter 3 of 2 Kings. And then in 2 Kings chapters 4 through 11, we'll see that entire passage this week. You're going to see the core of this week's reading. And it's a set of amazing stories about Elisha and his miracles. And I'm not going to go through it in detail because I don't want to ruin these amazing stories for you. But here's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to see miracles involving oil, the raising of a dead son, the feeding of starving people, the healing of leprosy, the floating of an axe head, one of the weirdest stories in the Bible, the blinding of an entire army, and the rescue from a siege. It's amazing stuff you're going to read this week. And this is all happening while the nations are turning away from God. So it's a very, very strange spot. And then this whole segment will end with the death of Jezebel and her family and the prophets of Baal. We'll then have a glimmer of hope in chapter 12 of 2 Kings, where Joash comes along, and he's a good king, but it doesn't last long. And then this week's reading will conclude in chapters 15 through 17 of 2 Kings with the fall of Samaria. This takes several years. Each kingdom, you're going to see north and south kingdoms go through a series of king after king after king as they continue to descend into further disobedience against God. We will end up at the last king of Israel, a king named Hoshea in chapter 17, and they'll be conquered by Assyria. So this is when we will then when we get to the prophets, eventually, we're going to see this whole time that we're reading this week prophesied in Hosea. Remember how I told you before, the Bible is generally chronological, but there are sections that step outside the chronology. And Hosea is one of the prophets who actually prophesies during the time we'll be reading about this week, even though we won't read Hosea's prophecy until many months from now. Okay, so that just gives you a tag for later. Okay, so how do we conclude this week's video as we look ahead to the reading this week? This is one of those weeks with stories that even if you're not a Bible reader, you may have some vague recollection over the language anyway, right? Chariots of Fire, right? There was a big movie about that. It's just a thing that we know about. Jezebel may be a term you've heard that's been used negatively and you wonder why. The oil that just lasts forever. These are stories that are fairly universal and that you may have heard at least the terms used outside of the Bible. This week, you'll see them in context. So pay attention to that this week. One of the things I do note about the reading this week is this. This week's reading will feel very similar to the readings out of the book of Judges. but it's actually on the opposite side of the book of Judges. Judges was a time of darkness and uncertainty before the height of the kingdoms of Saul and David and Solomon. This is a time of darkness and uncertainty after the height of the kingdoms of Saul and David and Solomon. So you kind of see this bell curve that happens during this. At the beginning, you got the time of Judges, you got the rise that peaks with Saul, David, and Solomon, and then you've got this fall, and it happens over a long period of time. As you go through it, you're going to see this king came and then left, and it feels boring. Look at the numbers and see how long these things took to take place, which also shows you how long they had to have an opportunity to turn this around. God was so patient with them for such a long period of time, and he sent them so many warnings and so many prophets, and they didn't pay attention. May we learn from their bad examples this week to do better in our own lives, to turn away from our sin when God continues to put warnings in our path. All right, that's this week. We'll see you next week.